Sarah Johnson was having a normal Tuesday morning until the pain started. At first, it was just a small ache in her stomach, something she tried to ignore while preparing documents for her upcoming court case. As a successful attorney at one of the city's top law firms, she was used to working through minor discomfort. But this pain was different. By lunchtime, the pain had grown so bad that Sarah could barely sit straight in her office chair. Her assistant, Maria, noticed something was wrong when she brought in some paperwork and saw Sarah's usually perfect posture crumpled over her desk. "Mrs. Johnson, are you okay?" Maria asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look really pale." Sarah tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "I don't think so," she admitted, pressing her hand against her stomach. "The pain keeps getting worse." Maria didn't waste any time. She immediately called for an Uber to take Sarah to Metropolitan General Hospital, which was closest to their office. She also tried calling Sarah's husband, Dr. Marcus Johnson, but his phone went straight to voicemail. This wasn't unusual. As chief of surgery at Central Hospital across town, he was often in long operations where he couldn't be reached. The Uber driver, seeing Sarah's condition, drove as fast as he safely could through the busy city streets. Every bump made Sarah wince, and by the time they reached the emergency room entrance, she was having trouble walking straight. The pain had become a burning fire in her side, spreading across her entire abdomen. In the emergency room, Sarah found herself in a crowded waiting area. Despite the intense pain, she managed to keep her composure as she approached the reception desk. The receptionist handed her a clipboard with forms to fill out, which Sarah completed with shaking hands. Her normally neat handwriting was barely readable as she wrote down her information. Sarah Johnson, 32 years old, attorney, insurance provider, emergency contact, Dr. Marcus Johnson. Her hands were trembling so badly that she had to stop several times while filling out the forms. The pain was now coming in waves, each one stronger than the last. Sarah noticed that she was starting to sweat, even though the emergency room was quite cool with its strong air conditioning. While waiting, Sarah kept trying to reach Marcus. She sent text messages explaining where she was and left voicemails when her calls went unanswered. She knew he would be worried sick when he finally saw them, but there was nothing else she could do. She just hoped someone would check on her soon. The pain was becoming unbearable. Other patients in the waiting room gave her concerned looks. An elderly woman sitting next to her offered her a tissue to wipe the sweat from her forehead. Sarah thanked her with a weak smile, trying to maintain her dignity despite feeling like her insides were being twisted into knots. After what seemed like forever, a nurse called her name. Sarah carefully stood up, gathering her strength to walk to the examination area. The nurse, whose name tag read Webster, looked at her with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. It wasn't exactly friendly, but at that point, Sarah was in too much pain to care about the nurse's attitude. "Follow me," Nurse Webster said curtly, leading Sarah to a small examination room. The fluorescent lights made Sarah's head hurt on top of everything else. She noticed how the nurse's eyes lingered on her expensive suit and designer handbag, but the woman's face remained impassive. As Sarah sat on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her, she hoped that help would come quickly. The pain was now constant, making it hard to think clearly. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning of what would turn into one of the most challenging experiences of her life, one that would expose deep-rooted problems in the healthcare system and eventually lead to significant changes in how patients were treated at Metropolitan General Hospital. The clock on the wall read 2:15 p.m. Sarah closed her eyes and took deep breaths, trying to manage the pain. She had no way of knowing that her real ordeal was just about to begin, and that the next few hours would not only change her life, but also impact the lives of countless future patients. Nurse Webster took Sarah's vital signs with quick, sharp movements. Her blood pressure was higher than normal, which wasn't surprising given the pain she was in. When the nurse asked Sarah to rate her pain on a scale of 1 to 10, Sarah thought carefully before answering. "It's a 9, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the waves of pain washing over her. "It feels like something is really wrong." Nurse Webster made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "A 9, she said, writing something on her clipboard. "Honey, if it was really a 9, you wouldn't be able to sit there so calmly talking to me." Sarah felt her face grow hot, but not from fever. She had dealt with difficult people before in court, so she kept her voice professional. "I assure you, The pain is severe. Could you please let the doctor know? The doctor will see you when they can, Nurse Webster replied, not looking up from her clipboard. We have lots of patients today with real emergencies. She emphasized the word real in a way that made Sarah's stomach tighten even more. As the nurse left the room, Sarah could hear her talking to someone in the hallway. Just another drama queen wanting attention. Webster's voice carried through the thin walls. Probably just gas or her monthly visitor. You know how some people are. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to focus on her breathing instead of the conversation outside. She had encountered prejudice before in her professional life. This felt different. This was about her health, her safety, and she was being dismissed without even being properly examined. Through the small window in the examination room, she could see other patients being called in to see the doctor. A white woman with a sprained ankle was quickly taken care of. A man complaining of a mild headache got immediate attention. Meanwhile, Sarah's pain continued to worsen, and sweat was now soaking through her expensive silk blouse. An hour passed, then 2. Sarah pressed the call button twice, but each time Nurse Webster appeared, she seemed more annoyed than before. The doctor will get to you when they can, became her standard response, delivered with an increasingly hostile tone. During the 3rd hour of waiting, Sarah started feeling nauseated. When she threw up in the small trash can beside the examination table, Nurse Webster appeared with a look of disgust. Now you're making a mess, she said, handing Sarah a paper towel. This kind of behavior isn't going to get you seen any faster. Sarah wiped her mouth with shaking hands. Please, she said, her professional composure finally cracking. Something is seriously wrong. I need to see a doctor. Everyone here needs to see a doctor, Webster replied coldly. But throwing a fit won't help. Some people think they can come in here and demand special treatment, but that's not how it works. The nurse's words carried a clear message that Sarah couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about being busy or having other patients. The way Webster looked at her, spoke to her, and dismissed her pain was part of a pattern Sarah had seen before, just never in such a dangerous situation. More time passed. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from her office. She could barely focus enough to read them. She had tried calling Marcus 3 more times, but his phone was still going to voicemail. The pain had spread across her entire abdomen now, and she was starting to feel lightheaded. Through her pain-filled haze, Sarah could hear Nurse Webster chatting and laughing with other staff members outside. She caught fragments of conversations about lunch plans and weekend activities, all while she sat there, getting increasingly ill. Sarah didn't know it then, but her suffering was being noticed by someone else in the emergency room. A young resident doctor passing by had glanced through her window several times, growing more concerned each time she saw Sarah's deteriorating condition. This doctor would soon become an unexpected ally in what was quickly becoming a dangerous situation. The emergency room's fluorescent lights seemed to grow brighter and more painful as Sarah's condition got worse. She had thrown up 3 more times in the past hour, and her silk blouse was now completely soaked with sweat. The pain that had started in her stomach was now spreading across her entire body, making even the slightest movement unbearable. Dr. Emily Chen, a first-year resident, had been watching Sarah's room during her rounds. Each time she passed by, she noticed how Sarah's skin had gotten paler and how she seemed to be curling up tighter and tighter on the examination table. Something about this situation didn't feel right to the young doctor. During her 3rd pass by Sarah's room, Dr. Chen stopped at the nurse's station where Nurse Webster was chatting with another nurse about her upcoming vacation plans. "Excuse me," Dr. Chen said politely, "but how long has the patient in room 4 been waiting?" Nurse Webster barely glanced up from her phone. "Oh, her? About 4 hours now. Says she has stomach pain, but you know how dramatic some people can be. Probably just wants attention or pain medications." Dr. Chen frowned, looking down at the chart. Her vital signs from admission show elevated blood pressure, and she reported severe abdominal pain. "Has anyone checked on her recently?" "I've been keeping an eye on her," Webster replied dismissively. "She's fine, just making a fuss because she thinks her fancy clothes and attitude should get her special treatment." Just then, a sharp cry of pain came from Sarah's room. Dr. Chen didn't wait for Nurse Webster's reaction. She rushed to check on the patient. When she entered the room, she found Sarah curled up in a fetal position, her face wet with tears and sweat. "Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Chen said gently, approaching the examination table. I'm Dr. Chen. I'm going to examine you, okay? Sarah could barely nod. Her eyes were glazed with pain, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. When Dr. Chen touched her abdomen, Sarah's whole body tensed up. Mrs. Johnson, how long have you been having this pain? Dr. Chen asked, her concern growing as she noticed how rigid Sarah's abdomen felt. Since morning, Sarah managed to whisper. It keeps getting worse. I tried to tell them. Dr. Chen's face grew serious as she continued her examination. She noticed Sarah's temperature was now significantly elevated, and her skin had a slight grayish tint. These were all signs that something was very wrong. Nurse Webster appeared in the doorway, looking annoyed. Doctor, there are other patients who've been waiting. Get me a full blood workup, now, Dr. Chen interrupted, her voice firm. And I want an immediate CT scan. This patient is showing signs of acute appendicitis with possible perforation. Webster's expression changed from annoyance to surprise, but she was just. Now, please, Dr. Chen said firmly, and page Dr. Roberts in surgery. We may need an operating room. As Webster hurried away, clearly flustered by being given direct orders from a resident, Dr. Chen turned back to Sarah. Mrs. Johnson, I'm so sorry you've had to wait so long. We're going to take care of you right away. Sarah tried to thank her, but another wave of pain hit, making her gasp. Dr. Chen quickly ordered pain medication and started organizing the necessary tests. She knew they were racing against time now. If her suspicions were correct, Sarah's condition was critical. In the hallway, other staff members had started to notice the sudden flurry of activity around room 4. Nurse Webster was making calls with shaking hands, her earlier confidence replaced by nervous energy. She had just pulled up Sarah's chart on the computer when she noticed something that made her face go pale. Under emergency contact, it listed Dr. Marcus Johnson, Chief of Surgery, Central Hospital. The next few minutes would bring a whirlwind of activity to the emergency room, as Sarah's true condition became clear and her husband's identity came to light. But for now, Dr. Chen focused solely on getting her patient the care she had needed hours ago, knowing that every minute counted in preventing a potentially tragic outcome. Dr. Chen moved through the emergency room with quick, purposeful steps, organizing everything Sarah needed. She had seen cases like this before during her medical training, and she knew they had already waited too long. Every minute mattered now. Get me a full panel of blood tests, she ordered one of the nurses, carefully avoiding Nurse Webster, who was still standing frozen at her computer. And start an IV line immediately. Mrs. Johnson is severely dehydrated. The emergency room suddenly felt different. Where there had been dismissal and delay before, there was now urgent activity. Other nurses, seeing Dr. Chen's serious expression, jumped in to help. They could tell by the young doctor's manner that this was a real emergency. Sarah lay on the examination table, barely conscious now. The pain medication was starting to help a little, but her condition was still getting worse. Dr. Chen stayed close, checking her vital signs every few minutes while they waited for the CT scan room to be prepared. Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Chen said gently, "Can you hear me? We're going to take good care of you now, I promise." Sarah managed to open her eyes slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Have you reached my husband?" Before Dr. Chen could answer, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A tall man in surgical scrubs burst through the emergency room doors, his face tight with worry. Dr. Marcus Johnson had finally gotten the messages about his wife. "Where is she?" His deep voice carried through the emergency room. "Where is Sarah Johnson?" Nurse Webster, who had been trying to look busy with paperwork, suddenly dropped her clipboard. The sound made everyone turn to look at her, including Dr. Marcus Johnson. His eyes narrowed as he saw the nurse's guilty expression. "Dr. Johnson," Dr. Chen called out, maintaining her professional composure. "Your wife is here. I'm Dr. Chen, and I just ordered emergency tests. We suspect appendicitis with possible perforation." Marcus rushed to Sarah's side, his face filling with concern and anger as he saw his wife's condition. As both a husband and a doctor, you could tell how serious things had become. "How long has she been here?" he demanded. 4 hours, Dr. Chen answered honestly, watching as Dr. Johnson's expression darkened. "I just took over her care 15 minutes ago." Marcus held Sarah's hand while checking her vital signs himself. his medical training and personal concern mixed together as he assessed her condition. "Why wasn't this caught sooner?" he asked, his voice dangerous quiet. Nurse Webster tried to slip away quietly, but Marcus noticed her movement. "Nurse," he said sharply, recognizing her from her name tag, "I'd like to know why my wife was left untreated for 4 hours with clear symptoms of acute appendicitis." Before Webster could stammer out an excuse, the CT scan team arrived. "We need to move her now," Dr. Chen said firmly, taking control of the situation. "Dr. Johnson, would you like to accompany us?" As they wheeled Sarah toward the CT scan room, other hospital staff began to realize who she was, and more importantly, who her husband was. Whispers spread quickly through the emergency room about the chief of surgery from Central Hospital whose wife had been neglected in their ER. Dr. Chen focused on her patient, ignoring the growing drama around her. She had done what any good doctor should do, paid attention to a patient in pain and taken action. As they reached the CT scan room, she caught Dr. Johnson looking at her with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being the one to finally help her." Sarah was carefully moved onto the CT scanner, and Dr. Chen prepared to get the images they needed. She knew that whatever happened next would have serious consequences for everyone involved, especially Nurse Webster. But right now, all that mattered was saving her patient. The CT scan images appeared on the screen, and the room fell silent. Dr. Marcus Johnson's face turned pale as he looked at the results. As chief of surgery at Central Hospital, he had seen many cases like this, but seeing it happen to his own wife made his hands shake with both fear and anger. "Her appendix has ruptured," he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "We need an operating room immediately." Dr. Chen was already moving, calling the surgical team while nurses prepared Sarah for emergency surgery. The hospital administrator, Dr. Peters, had just arrived after hearing that the chief of surgery from their biggest rival hospital was in their emergency room. "Dr. Johnson," Peters said nervously, "I just heard about what happened. I want you to know we'll conduct a full investigation." Later, Marcus cut him off sharply. "Right now, my wife needs surgery. I want your best surgical team ready in 10 minutes. Down in the emergency room, Nurse Webster sat at her station, her face ashen. Other nurses walked past her, some shaking their heads, others whispering among themselves. Everyone had heard by now how she had dismissed the wife of one of the most respected surgeons in the city. "Nurse Webster," a stern voice called. It was the head nurse, Mrs. Martinez, who had just been briefed about the situation. "In my office now." As Webster followed Mrs. Martinez, she could hear the emergency room staff talking about Sarah's case. Some nurses were looking through Sarah's chart, shocked at how clear the symptoms had been. A young nurse was crying, saying she had wanted to say something but felt too intimidated by Webster to speak up. Meanwhile, in the operating room preparation area, Sarah was being readied for surgery. The anesthesiologist checked her vital signs while Dr. Chen gave the surgical team a quick briefing about what had happened in the emergency room. Marcus held Sarah's hand as they prepared to put her under anesthesia. "You're going to be fine, honey," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm here now." Sarah managed a weak smile. "I tried to reach you," she whispered. I know," he said, kissing her forehead. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there sooner." Dr. Chen watched this exchange, feeling both sad and angry about how things had gone so wrong. As a young resident, she had been taught to always listen to patients and take their pain seriously. Seeing how Sarah had been treated went against everything she believed about medical care. In the hospital administrator's office, Dr. Peters was making urgent phone calls. This kind of incident could lead to a serious lawsuit, especially given who the patient was. But more than that, it had exposed a problem in their emergency room that couldn't be ignored. "Get me all of Nurse Webster's patient records for the past year," he told his assistant. "And contact our legal department. We need to review every complaint filed about emergency room care." Back in the operating room, the surgical team was ready to begin. Marcus wanted to perform the surgery himself, but he knew he was too emotionally involved. Instead, he watched from the observation room as Dr. Williams, their best surgeon, prepared to operate on Sarah. Through the glass, you could see the damage that 4 hours of neglect had caused. What should have been a simple appendectomy had turned into a complex emergency surgery. The infection had spread, making everything more dangerous. Dr. Chen stood next to Marcus in the observation room, both of them watching as the surgery began. "Dr. Johnson," she said quietly, "I want you to know that this shouldn't have happened. Not to your wife, not to anyone." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the surgery below. "No, it shouldn't have," he replied. "And I promise you, Dr. Chen, things are going to change around here. What happened today isn't just about my wife. It's about every patient who comes through those emergency room doors." The surgery lasted 3 hours longer than a normal appendectomy should have taken. Dr. Williams worked carefully to clean out the infection that had spread through Sarah's abdomen. In the observation room, Marcus hadn't moved from his spot, his eyes fixed on every movement of the surgical team below. Dr. Chen had stayed too, even though her shift had ended an hour ago. She felt responsible for Sarah's care now, having been the one to finally step in and help her. While they watched the surgery, she quietly told Marcus everything that had happened in the emergency room. "When I first saw her chart," Dr. Chen explained, "I couldn't believe no one had examined her properly. The symptoms were so clear." Marcus's jaw tightened as he listened. "Tell me," he said quietly, "have you seen this kind of thing happen before? Patients being dismissed like this?" Dr. Chen hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Yes," she admitted. "Especially with minority patients. Some staff, they make assumptions. They don't listen when certain patients describe their pain." Down in the operating room, Dr. Williams was closing up the final incision. He looked up at the observation room and gave a small nod. The surgery had been successful, but the complications from the delay had made everything more difficult. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Sarah lay unconscious, connected to various machines that tracked her vital signs. The infection had been severe, and she would need strong antibiotics and careful monitoring for several days. Marcus sat beside her bed, holding her hand. He had changed out of his surgical scrubs into regular clothes, but the tension hadn't left his face. As chief of surgery at Central Hospital, he had seen many cases of medical negligence, but this was different. This was personal. Dr. Peters, the hospital administrator, came to check on Sarah's condition. He found Marcus reviewing all of Sarah's emergency room documentation, making notes on a legal pad. "Dr. Johnson," Peters said nervously, "I want you to know we're taking this very seriously. Nurse Webster has been suspended pending a full investigation." "Suspended?" Marcus looked up from his notes. "This goes beyond one nurse, Dr. Peters. I've been reading through your ER records. There's a pattern here that needs to be addressed." Just then, Sarah began to stir, her eyes fluttered open, and she tried to focus on her surroundings. Marcus immediately moved closer, squeezing her hand gently. "Hey," he said softly. "You're going to be okay. The surgery went well." Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was dry from the breathing tube. A nurse quickly brought her some ice chips. After a moment, she managed to whisper, "How bad was it?" "Your appendix ruptured," Marcus explained gently. If Dr. Chen hadn't stepped in when she did, he couldn't finish the sentence. Dr. Peters shifted uncomfortably by the door. "Mrs. Johnson, on behalf of Metropolitan General, I want to apologize." "Save it," Marcus interrupted. "Your apology won't change what happened. What needs to change is your entire emergency room system." Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand weakly. Even in her groggy state, she understood what had happened to her. As a lawyer, she knew this kind of discrimination happened in hospitals every day, but now she had experienced it firsthand. "We need to do something," she whispered. "Not just for me, for everyone." Marcus nodded, looking at Dr. Peters with determination. "Oh, we will," he said firmly. "This isn't going to be swept under the rug. What happened today could have cost my wife her life, and I'm going to make sure it never happens to another patient in this hospital again." Dr. Peters could see the storm coming. This wasn't just about one incident or one nurse anymore. The chief of surgery's wife had been neglected in their emergency room, and now both the prominent surgeon and a lawyer were going to demand changes. The hospital would never be the same after this. 1 week after Sarah's emergency surgery, the conference room at Metropolitan General Hospital was packed. The hospital board had called an emergency meeting to address what people were now calling the Johnson incident. News of what had happened had spread through the medical community like wildfire. Marcus sat at the long table, a thick folder of documents in front of him. Over the past week, he had worked with Sarah's law firm to gather evidence of similar incidents at the hospital. What they found was disturbing. Dozens of complaints about emergency room care, many following the same pattern of dismissed symptoms and delayed treatment. "Let me be clear," Marcus said, his voice firm as he addressed the board. "What happened to my wife wasn't an isolated incident. Your emergency room has a systematic problem with bias in patient care." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Peters, who had barely slept all week, cleared his throat. "We've already suspended Nurse Webster, and we're implementing new training." "That's not enough," a new voice interrupted. Sarah Johnson, still pale but recovering, walked into the conference room. She moved carefully, still sore from surgery, but her lawyer's presence filled the room. Marcus stood to help her to a seat, but she waved him off, standing tall despite her discomfort. "I've reviewed the hospital's records," Sarah said, placing her own folder on the table. "In the past year alone, there were 47 complaints about emergency room care. 38 of those complaints came from minority patients. The pattern is clear." The board chairman, Dr. Thompson, leaned forward. "Mrs. Johnson, we understand your concern, but these kinds of statistics can be complicated." "There's nothing complicated about it," Sarah cut in. "I'm not just here as a victim of negligence. I'm here as an attorney who specializes in civil rights cases. What happened to me was discrimination, plain and simple." Dr. Chen, who had been invited to the meeting, spoke up from her seat. "I've witnessed it myself," she said quietly. "Some patients are taken seriously immediately. Others are made to wait, their pain dismissed, their concerns ignored. It has to stop." The room fell silent. On a screen behind them, Sarah's legal team had projected a chart showing emergency room wait times broken down by patient demographics. The numbers were impossible to ignore. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, standing beside his wife. "First, Nurse Webster isn't just going to be suspended. She needs to be terminated. Her behavior shows a pattern of discrimination that puts patients' lives at risk." Sarah nodded, opening her folder. "Second, we're demanding a complete overhaul of emergency room protocols. Every patient needs to be evaluated using the same objective criteria. Wait times need to be monitored and reviewed regularly for bias." "And third," Marcus added, "we want mandatory bias training for all staff, not just a one-time session, but ongoing education and evaluation." Dr. Chen has agreed to help develop the program. The board members looked at each other nervously. They knew the Johnsons had the power to make this a very public issue. The hospital's reputation and their jobs were on the line. "If these changes aren't implemented," Sarah said firmly, "my law firm is prepared to file a class action lawsuit on behalf of every patient who has experienced similar discrimination in your emergency room." Dr. Thompson wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. "These changes will be expensive and time-consuming." "Not as expensive as a lawsuit and the loss of your hospital's accreditation," Marcus replied. "This isn't a negotiation. This is your chance to fix a broken system before someone else dies from neglect." The message was clear. The hospital could either make these changes voluntarily, or they would be forced to make them through legal action. Either way, the days of discriminatory treatment in the emergency room were coming to an end. 6 months after Sarah's emergency surgery, Metropolitan General Hospital's emergency room looked very different. New signs in multiple languages welcomed patients, and a large digital board displayed current wait times for everyone to see. But the biggest changes weren't the ones you could see. They were in how the hospital worked. Sarah stood at a podium in the hospital's main conference room, addressing a group of medical staff from hospitals across the city. She had fully recovered from her surgery, and now she was using her experience to help others. "Today marks the launch of our new emergency care equality program," she announced, looking across the room filled with doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, but it took nearly losing my life to expose problems that many patients had faced for years." In the audience, Dr. Chen sat next to Marcus, both of them wearing pins that identified them as members of the hospital's new patient advocacy board. The board reviewed all emergency room complaints and monitored treatment patterns to catch any signs of bias. "Our new system has already shown results," Sarah continued, changing the slide to show their latest statistics. Average wait times are down by 40%, and more importantly, they're now the same for all patients, regardless of their background. At the back of the room, many of the original emergency room staff watched and listened. Some had initially resisted the changes, but the new protocols had made their jobs easier, not harder. Clear guidelines meant less guesswork, and regular training helped them understand and overcome their unconscious biases. Nurse Webster's replacement, a compassionate nurse named Janet Torres, had helped design a new patient intake system. Every patient was now evaluated using the same checklist, and pain complaints were taken seriously regardless of who reported them. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah said, gesturing to a young woman in the audience. Maria Rodriguez, would you please stand and share your experience? Maria stood up nervously. 3 weeks ago, I came to this emergency room with severe stomach pain, she said. I was scared because of stories I'd heard about hospitals ignoring Latino patients. But the nurse listened to me, the doctor examined me quickly, and they found my gallbladder problem before it got dangerous. The old system might have sent me home until it was too late. Marcus squeezed Dr. Chen's shoulder proudly. She had been promoted to head of emergency medicine training, teaching new doctors and nurses how to provide equal care to all patients. Her quick action in Sarah's case had shown everyone what good medical care looked like. Change isn't easy, Sarah acknowledged, looking around the room, but it's necessary. Today, I'm proud to announce that 5 other hospitals in our city have agreed to adopt our equality program. This isn't just about one hospital anymore, it's about changing how emergency medicine works everywhere. After the presentation, Sarah and Marcus walked through the emergency room together. They stopped to talk with patients and staff, checking that the new systems were working smoothly. The atmosphere was different now, more organized, more respectful, more human. Dr. Peters, who had initially feared these changes would cause problems, now proudly showed other hospital administrators how their new system worked. The hospital's reputation had actually improved, with patients traveling from other cities to receive care there. You know, Marcus said to Sarah as they finished their rounds, something good really did come from that terrible day. We're helping people we'll never even meet. Sarah nodded, watching a nurse carefully explain treatment options to an elderly patient in his own language using their new translation service. That's what justice looks like, she said softly. Not just fixing one wrong, but making sure it never happens again. The emergency room doors opened, bringing in a new patient. Sarah and Marcus watched as the staff sprang into action, following their new protocols perfectly. Every patient now had a chance to be heard, to be believed, to be treated with dignity. The change that had started with one nurse's prejudice and one doctor's courage had grown into something bigger than anyone expected. Metropolitan General had become a model for other hospitals, proving that fair and equal emergency care wasn't just the right thing to do. It was the best way to save lives.